Hey everybody, it's Dan, and in this video we're going to be looking at one of the oldest defenses for black to the king's pawn opening, the Scandinavian. Now the Scandinavian was recorded as early as the 15th century, and has gone through various ebbs and revivals in its popularity, but it survives to this day, enjoying top-level play from grandmasters and other players. The reason I'm going over the Scandinavian is because while it's old, the theory is finite enough to fit all into one video, and also because while I see it online a lot when I play as white, I wanted to know the best way to respond. After researching the defense, it turns out that if white plays well and accurately, they should have no problem securing a solid position out of the opening. That being said, there are some things white needs to be aware of, and that's the goal of this video, so that both white and black know what they need to look out for. So the Scandinavian defense opens with pawn to e4 and then d5. This immediately breaks the symmetry of the board, like the Sicilian, Alekhine, and French defenses. We have pawn e captures d, and then from here black has two main options. The first is the main line, queen captures on d5, and the second is simply knight out to f6. First we'll go through the main line and a couple of minor variations, and then we'll look at knight f6 because there are a lot of options for both players in that variation. So, in this variation we're going to have queen captures on d5, and this invites a tempo with the knight playing out to c3. And after this the queen is simply going to swing over to a5. Now there are, however, other variations you might see, such as queen to d8 or queen to d6. Queen to d8 is considered nowadays to be much too passive, since black brought the queen out for a reason, to impact the center, and then immediately retreats the queen, ceding the center right back to white. One line that could happen after queen to d8 is simply d4 from white. Black prepares to fianchetto on the king side. We have bishop out to f4, fianchetto the bishop for black onto g7, and then we have queen to d2. Now queen to d2 is preparing to get rid of the fianchettoed bishop after the knight moves. Black here might think to immediately get the queens off the board by capturing on d4, and then we have a queen exchange. But after this, we have knight to b5, preparing to fork on c7. So bishop to b6 is necessary to defend. But then the knight actually can just capture the pawn anyway, and white in the end is left with the bishop pair and an open center. And this will definitely end up favoring white. So to go back then to this position right here, it turns out that going in for a queen exchange is not the best move for black. Instead, black can continue with development with knight to f6, white can castle long, and then c6 keeps the knight from playing to b5 and causing problems on c7. So now white can challenge the fianchettoed bishop, and black should just castle, because this protects the bishop, and if bishop captures on h6, the queen is going to be deep in black's territory. So after castle, we have h4, and as we can see, white is already getting the kingside initiative going. So all that is just one example of what can result from the black queen immediately retreating to d8 after recapturing the pawn on d5. Again, it's just a bit of a passive move, and so if you're going to bring the queen out early, you should probably fight to leave it there. Another option, as I said, in this position is queen to d6, and this is called the Bronstein variation. Here again, white's going to play d4 into the center, and then knight f6, knight f3, and a6 from black to limit the white bishop's scope. And then the bishop is going to play to d3. We have knight to c6, queen d2, and then the bishop comes down to attack the knight. Note that the bishop is only attacking the knight, not pinning it. So those are two variations that can result from this position right here, again after the queen captures the pawn on d5. However, to get back to the main lines, we have, like I said before, queen out to a5, and then again from white, knight to d4, a knight f6, and then knight to f3. And right here, it seems that black already doesn't have many good moves. Bishop to g4 is the main line, and this is just met right away with h6, and there isn't really a good reaction for black. If the bishop backs up, then we just have pawn to g4, forcing bishop to g6, and then the knight plays to e5. This forces black to play c6 in order to keep the queen from being lost, because the knight was threatening to come to c4, which would have trapped the white queen. So after this we have pawn to c6 to save the queen, and then from here h4 can be played, and white is definitely more active in this position. And to go back here to when white initially put the question to the bishop, let's just say that from here the bishop decides to capture the knight on f3. Well, the queen obviously can recapture, and then we have c6, bishop down, bishop out to b2 from white, knight on b to d7, and then castling long. And white, again, here definitely has a more active position. So the point is, after bishop to g4, if we go back to this position here, after bishop to g4, black is going to just end up reacting to white for several moves, or falling behind in development. And if white plays correctly, they're going to be able to continue to dictate the flow of the game. But to go back a move, on move 5 for black, let's say that the bishop, instead of playing out to g4, plays out only to b5. Well, we're going to end up with a very similar setup. After the knight plays to e5, again, this is forcing c6 in order to save the queen. And then we have g4, black's finding itself basically in the same bind. Another option on move 5 for black right here is an immediate c6. This move immediately provides an escape route for the queen. From here, white can either cramp black's position with something like bishop to c4, and after bishop to f5, we have knight to e5, a theme that you should recognize by now in the Scandinavian. We have e6, and then g4, leading to positions similar to those that we've already looked at, where black's light square bishop just looks silly. The black bishop here is going to back up to g6, we have h4 again, knight on b to d7, and after an exchange of knights and h5, the bishop can play only to e4, but here white can just castle and they're going to be fine. So something else that white can play after c6 is immediately played from black on move 5, if we go back here, is instead of the bishop out to c4, they can also play bishop to d2. From here, the queen is going to retreat to b6, which is putting pressure on the b2 pawn. And now we have bishop to c4 from white. Black develops bishop to f5. White simply backs up the bishop to b3, which is covering the pawn on b2. We have e6 from black, queen to e2, bishop e7, castling long for white, knight on b to d7, and rook on h to e1, and white here also stands a little bit better. Finally, to go back to move 5 here in the main line for black, one last option that black has is the knight move out to c6. What this move is doing is basically trying to allow black to develop the queen side and to castle long as quickly as possible. So white can still end up with a better position, but it requires pretty accurate play. We have bishop to d2, and then the response bishop down to g4, knight to b5 opens a discovered attack on the black queen, and the knight is protected by the bishop on f1. Queen to b6 is the only move, and c4 threatens to trap the queen altogether. Black can try to salvage the position with bishop captures on f3, queen captures on f3, and then an exchange on d4. After this, however, queen captures on b7, and really the best thing for black to do in this position is just to exchange the queens with a check on e4, and then the bishop simply moves to attack the knight. White here has the bishop pair on an open board with a 3-2 majority on the queen side, and so again, they are definitely better. So to go back a couple of moves here to get back to this position, right here on move 2, those are all things that can result from an immediate queen out to d5. However, like I said, there is another move in this position, and it is knight out to f6. The idea behind this move is not to recapture the pawn right away, and to avoid the tempo on the queen. From here, the best move by far is just to play d4. Holding on to the pawn with a move like c4 leads to a couple of different gambit lines. which all of are good for black. For example, we can have c6, and then an exchange of pawns on c6 and the recapturing with the knight, and in this position black has great center control with the knights. Alternatively, we can have pawn to e6. This is called the Icelandic gambit. What can happen here is once the pawn captures dc and the bishop recaptures, white, if they aren't careful and they play a natural looking move like pawn to d4, is going to end up in some real hot water. This is in fact perhaps the only time white doesn't want to play d4 right away. What can happen in this position is bishop out to b4 check, white blocks the check with the bishop, queen to e7, we have an exchange on b4, and here the king is still in check. The queen can block this time, but the black queen is just going to retreat back to e7. Queen to e2 from white stops the discovered check on the king. Black continues with knight to c6, knight to f3. We have castling long for black, and d5, which looks like a good fork, but after rook on h to e8, white is in some serious trouble. The problem in this position is that if the pawn captures either the knight or the bishop, white is going to lose either the queen or the game. I can show you what that looks like. If we have pawn on d capturing the bishop on e6, then black can play queen to b4 check. White blocks with the knight, otherwise the rook captures the queen. And after the knight block, though, rook to e6 and the queen is lost. Alternatively, if the pawn captures the knight on c6, then the game also ends pretty quickly. This starts with bishop out to c4. The queen is pinned, and there's nothing white can really do to prevent checkmate. The move order can be switched, but the result will always be the same. One example is queen captures on e7, and then the rook recaptures on e7, hitting a check, and then here the bishop is going to block, but after rook captures on e2 check, the king can only retreat to f1. And then the other rook comes down to hit a final check, and after the block with the knight, either rook can move in to hit checkmate. So that's what not to do as white in the Icelandic gambit. Let me go back here to this position right here. So again, in this position, white does not want to play d4 right away. The best move for white in this position is just going to be knight out to f3, followed by knight c6 from black, and now d4. The bishop can come down and hit a check on b4, knight c3 to block, and knight e4. Then here we can have bishop to d2. And in this position, black has almost a 3/4 point advantage positionally. So those are the positions that can arise if black tries to hold on to the pawn here after the knight plays out to f6. But as is often the case in gambits and openings, holding on to any material advantage early on in the game usually leads to trouble for that player. So as I said before, the best move in this position is just going to be pawn to d4 for white, not even trying to hold on to the pawn. From here, the knight can capture on d5, and after c4, the knight has a decision. There are 3 squares that the knight can play to: back to f6, b6, and b4. We'll take a look at b4 first. Knight to b4 can lead to some wild positions. For example, if the queen comes out to a4 to hit a check, knight on the 8th to c6 to block. And here, white has to be careful, because while it looks natural to push d5 and attack the pinned piece, this ultimately will cause white some major headaches. After d5, b5 from black puts the white queen in a very awkward position. White is pretty much forced into taking the pawn. If the queen retreats to a3, we have a fork and the queen is gone, game over. If queen to b3 in this position, the knight can play to d4, attacking the queen, and the knight on b4 is safe, because if queen captures b4, then we're going to have another fork on c2 and the game's going to be over again. At the same time, even if white doesn't take the knight on b4, both knights are converging on c2, so there's going to be a fork with at least the loss of a rook. The same thing happens if the queen runs back home in this position right here. We can just have the knight playing out to d4, and again, both knights are converging on c2. So again, basically in this position, queen captures d5 is forced. After that, knight to c2 again puts white in a big knot. After king to d2, we can have bishop to d7, and white has to be very careful. Something careless like king captures on c2 loses the queen right away, and in this position, if the pawn captures the knight, then the queen is going to be lost after the discovered check. Or if black really wants to be sadistic, they can play bishop to g4 check, and the black king is basically going to be forced out into the center of the board, and white's going to be sweating for the rest of the game. So instead of an immediate d5 in this position, pawn to a3 kicks the knight back to a6. But still, in this position, white needs to avoid d5 because of the reply knight to c6, attacking the queen. The queen is going to play to b5 in order to maintain the pin, but after e6 and a6, the queen is toast. If e6 here from black, white doesn't want to take the knight because that will result in white losing the queen after b6, and then here just something like knight out to f3, and then a6, and the queen is lost. And if here after e6, white plays knight out to f3, then again a6 just traps the queen right away. So once again, in this position, white needs to resist playing d5 and instead should simply develop bishop out to e3, and this right here is a dead equal position. So again, to go back, knight to b4 is a very interesting move. It's a very sharp line, and it requires very accurate play from white to avoid major loss of material, and accurate play from black to exploit any mistakes the white may make. Besides that, after c4 from white, knight to b6 is possible, which is kind of a la Alekhine's defense. After that, we can have knight to f3, bishop down to g4, and c5. Now here, it's very important for black to insert an in-between move of bishop captures on f3, because if in this position we just have knight to d5, queen to b3 is going to hit the knight and b7. And if bishop captures on f3, queen captures on b7 is still available. And if the knight moves, you can just have the queen capturing on f3, and white is up a pawn with a good position. So first, if we go back here, instead of reacting to the threat on the knight, black needs to play again the in-between move of bishop captures on f3. After the queen captures on f3, now black can play knight to d5. If white still goes for an attack on b7, the pawn here can just push. Bishop to g5 prevents pawn to e6, so the queen gets out of it by playing d7. Knight to c3 from white, and now we have e6, and a series of exchanges can take place on d5, after which c6 puts a lock on the queen side for white. The pawn can't be taken because if it is, the bishop can play to b5 and this pins the knight, and there's really only so much support that can be lent before that knight is going to fall. So that's knight to b6 in this position, and finally the last move is the knight can just play back to f6. Now this is maybe a little passive because the knight is just going back to the square that it just came from, and here we can have the development from white of knight to f3, and then the bishop down to g4, bishop e2 to break the pin, e6, bishop to e7, bishop to e3, then bishop to e7 from black, and knight to c3, and white here has a small positional advantage as well. So that's basically the Scandinavian defense. I tried to make this video as exhaustive as I could to include all the main lines and the popular variations, the Icelandic gambit, and so on, all the lines that you might come across. My final thought on the Scandinavian defense is that while it has some very interesting lines like the Icelandic gambit and knight out to b4, I think it's just a little too sketchy for black. Again, accurate play from white in almost all variations negates black's early queen move and the broken symmetry on the board, which would normally favor black. It seems like the best lines really require white to make some sort of mistake or miscalculation. Now, if you're playing black against someone who doesn't know the Scandinavian, as you've seen, it's actually quite easy for white to slip up, and if they do, as black you can really make them pay. But if white plays well, they should be able to handle Scandinavian no problem. Anyway, that'll do it for this video. Stay tuned for the Grandmaster video, which I'll try to have up soon. Questions, comments, and ratings are always welcome. Thanks for watching, and take care.